Welcome back. The United Nations and aid agencies are looking to this Doha conference to give some firm commitments to the pledges made 6 years ago. The Monterey Consensus, the Millennium Development Goals, though not all are hopeful. As well as pushing for developed nations to honour prior promises, the conference is calling for an overhaul of what are known as the Bretton Woods institutions, things like the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank. They're hoping for a more democratic approach to managing the world's finances. This is being opposed by the so-called capitalist nations who haven't turned up to this meeting. Official development assistance currently runs at $100 billion a year, but that's a small amount compared with what's being spent to try to stem the fallout from this global financial meltdown. And aid agencies are now worried the banking crisis will overshadow what this conference is trying to achieve. Still with us, our guests all here in Doha, Stefano Manservisi, Brian Hook and Sylvia Boren. Thanks for staying with us. Let's go back to Brian Hook first of all. This idea about overhauling these very big, very important institutions, the IMF, the World Bank, and this idea that perhaps more capitalist nations are opposed to it. Give us some insight into why.
Well, let me first pick up on something which Sylvia said earlier. We might be attending different UN conferences because nothing what she said actually bears any reflection in terms of what's going on, in fact, at the UN conference. We've been working for 5 months in New York on a consensus document, and I think we're very close to full agreement on a consensus text. I'd also would remind folks that under the presidency of George Bush, we have doubled foreign aid. From 2000 to 2006, it's gone from $10 billion to $23 billion, which is the largest increase in foreign aid since the Marshall Plan. But what we're also trying to do is we're trying to get beyond this old paradigm of measuring aid just simply in terms of official development assistance. And we certainly have met our Monterey commitments. But the real accomplishment of the Monterey Consensus was going past these old paradigms of inputs and looking at really focusing on results. And one of the things that we see in countries that have pulled themselves out of difficult poverty situations is a total economic integration, which sees foreign aid as a catalyst, as a way to jumpstart things. But really, if you're going to see sustained economic growth, it's going to depend on trade and it's going to depend on private enterprise. And earlier I had talked about the importance of private financial flows to the developing world. The United States in 2006, if you look at private financial flows to the developing world, were $133 billion. In that same year, foreign aid globally was $29 billion. So when you look at what really counts and what really changes outcomes on the ground, foreign aid is really a small piece of it. In spite of that, we still, as I said, we've doubled our foreign aid, but we really need to focus on results and on mutual accountability. And a lot of the speeches I hear at this conference are kind of stuck in that old paradigm.
So is moving past that old paradigm then also, as the point I was making at the start of this half of the show, about rejigging, if you like, the world financial order and changing where the power base, in fact, spreading the power out more evenly, more democratically?
Well, we just had in Washington, President Bush convened the G20 meeting that included the Secretary General, it included the IMF, it included the World Bank, it included the head of the United Nations Development Program. The folks who are in that room represent 90% of global GDP, and they come from every part of the world. And so it's really hard to understand this accusation that somehow this is some sort of narrow grouping of people. The Treasury Department talked with all of the finance ministers in Africa before the meeting of G20. Our embassies have been reaching out to the developing world. We've had broad economic engagement before, during, and after the recent summit, and that will continue in a variety of fora, the OECD, IMF, World Bank, G20. There are a lot of fora where we're trying to resolve this financial crisis. Okay,
let me put some of this to Stefano Manservisi, because as he pointed out earlier, President Sarkozy of France, head of the EU at the moment, has come to Doha, and he seems to be, Stefano, taking or trying to take very much a leading role in any sort of change in a global financial order. Tell me what exactly, and not just France, what exactly Europe can offer to a change in the way that we operate global finance.
Well, first, I think that we were talking at the beginning of the burden on the oil-producing country. I say that so far we are bearing 60% of the total official assistance, and therefore I would like that everybody is doing his part of the job. Because just to come back to what Brian just said, on which I totally agree that we have to invent new paradigm. But I think that we should also start on sound basis, because the starting point to be credible in delivering what we've said. So I think that everybody has his own problem at home. I think that we should find all together the appropriate solution. But one of the pieces of the solution is to deliver also aid, is to deliver official assistance aid. Then private investment should come too, and this is linked to the responsibility on our partners also to create a conducive business environment, which is part also of our agenda.
Are you talking about things like adding technology and know-how and assistance in that form, not just in the form of cash handouts?
Well, no, I think that we as Europeans, we also have our view on the fact that, in our opinion, a bigger part of official assistance should go through budget support, for example, to give means to the budget to our partners, in particular empowering more their civil society and their parliament in order to have, as we have, the means in their budget in order to plan their future, in particular in education, in particular in healthcare. This is what matters. And certainly we should need and look for additional resources, including private investment. But what they need is also official aid in order to do their investment. Now, concerning the architecture, I think that we have here a big problem, which is about substance and about architecture. Substance, I think that if we take the major crisis on food, on finance, and on climate change, I think that we have to find solutions which are responding to all of this. This is money. This is spend money better in a more coordinated way. And third is to find right policy. I came on the climate change because, again, I don't want that the Europeans will at the end be isolated again in willing more, because I think that this is what we need. We need the right policies in order to tackle the climate change. We need binding commitment in Poznan in order to reduce CO2 emissions. This, jointly with supplementary effort for food, supplementary effort in official assistance and private investment, could make an operation which in itself is difficult also credible. Now, at the end, I think that we should also think in terms of how World Bank, IMF, and the international institution, the G8 itself, should change in order to take aboard more all those which are excluded, which are not only the emerging countries, emerging power, but also the poorest.
Okay.
Either we find a consensual way to build a new international order, or I fear we'll have just a short-time solution, will not last.
Okay. Well, just before we run out of time, let's go back to Sylvia Boren, because I know she's been itching to say something. I'm still going to ask you a question, though, because the word we've come up with here is inventing new paradigms. How would you like to see new paradigms invented which incorporate the developing world?
We have to have people-centered development, and that means we have to have women at the table of the decision makers. We have to see what the countries need, and that is a process in country, in developing countries, between their parliaments and their civil societies. At the moment, the women's organizations around the world are receiving $100 million a year. That's nothing. Women are not involved in this development process at all. I'm surprised at some of the old institutions like World Bank and particularly IMF being brought back in to try and solve this crisis. I'm surprised that the casino capitalism isn't really seen as for what it is. We have to have a paradigm shift, which means that we know for the climate change and for the financial problems we're having, we need to look at our consumption patterns, and we need to have fair trade, and that's not the same as free trade, and we need to make sure that it's a democratic process, that there's oversight. At the moment, there's a lot of taxes being lost to developing countries and going into the developed countries. There's a lot of tax havens. We know a lot, there's still debts that have to be freed up, and America has doubled its aid, but its aid is about the lowest. I come from Holland, where we have 0.8. America hasn't even got 0.2. So there's a lot of things. We know how to do it, but people have to be at the center, and people who live in poverty and that is increasingly women, have to be brought into the decision-making situations. They know how they want to develop, and yes, then we can have education, health, sustainable economies on the ground in developing countries, and from there you can build a fair trade global system that has to be overseen by a democratic United Nations that is effective. The G20 is not within the United Nations at the moment in a good way. The G20 are the powerful countries. That is not democracy. The voices of the African people and the voices of women are still not playing a big role, and that's the paradigm shift we need. We need sustainable development, which is about people and people's lives. And when we still see that more than a third of the world is living in abject poverty, I don't see how you can call that a sustainable situation. And the rich countries are causing the climate problems, are now causing the financial crisis, and are not taking their responsibility and listening properly to both the governments and particularly the civil society on the ground.
Okay,
there are
then.
a lot of plans.
We're going to have to leave it.
And a lot of possibilities.
Unfortunately, that's where we'll have to leave it. My thanks to our guest, Stefano Manservisi, to Brian Hook, and also to Sylvia Boren. Thank you for joining us, and thank you, our viewer, for joining us here on this edition of Inside Story. Your comments, your suggestions, send them in to us. Why not? InsideStory@aljazeera.net. From the whole team, goodbye for now.